Joining us at the Molly Brown House Museum virtually for the first installment of an exclusive Art with Amy Gallery Talk series. I'm Amy, and these are our guest speakers that you can see on the screen. Brian, Annie, Becky, and Andrea is here to help us. She's the director of the museum. So we're going to take a closer look at the museum's art collection through elevated conversations guided by local experts. So we're hoping to make this a series where we can talk about different objects in the house. Our first installation will feature Lady with Parrot. It's a Brown family original that hangs in the drawing room. Joining Amy will be Becky Black, professor of art history. We have Brian Myres, an ornithologist and professor, and Annie Willson, a professional artist and art teacher. Following the conversation, Annie will create a clayboard etching art piece incorporating birds and feathers. You might see a theme emerging. And then if you have purchased the art kit, you will please join us to create your own artwork. So thank you all for coming to our event this evening. I'll be your host for this evening of Art with Amy, a closer view. We have a wonderful night planned for you. It's going to be a super informative and a creative time. As Andrea mentioned, we are recording this event and we'll send you the link after the event is over. During the event, we ask that you stay muted, except during the audience participation portions. And you are welcome to turn your cameras on and off. That's totally up to you. We do ask that you turn them on for just a moment so we can capture the total number of people who were here for funding purposes. All right, well, thank you for that. Finally, we'd love to know where everyone is from. If you could quickly let us know where you're from, that would be great. Go ahead and drop that into the chat. And at any point, you may drop questions into the chat and we will get back to you when we can. Now, let's get the evening started. In a Paris newspaper from January 20th in 1929, Margaret Brown stated, "Some people find it strange that an American woman should aspire to play the roles of Bernhardt. I recall too that some people smirked when I brought home ancient statuary from Egypt and decorated up a few acres of the Rocky Mountains for my home. But I am sure that those who know the place will agree that culture knows no boundaries and that fine arts are international. Our program has its roots in Margaret's love of art and the Parisian salon. Margaret likely attended one of these events at the fin de siècle. Salons were a profound indicator of what a woman could represent in society, powerful and intellectual. The painting we are looking at tonight belonged to the Browns. It's hanging in the drawing room and it is titled Lady with Parrot. Here's what we know about this beautiful painting. It's a painting of a young woman in a nightdress holding a parrot and sitting beside a bed of classic revival style. The colors are principally blues, gold, and cream with some crimson on gold. The canvas is a highly varnished and it is an elaborate gold frame with plaster of Paris buildup of acanthus leaves and with beading on the inner edge of the frame. Margaret and JJ visited Paris in the summer of 1896 and possibly purchased this piece and others. It's painted by Charles Alexander Cassin de la Fascin in the 19th century. Other works of his can be seen in museums in Paris, Vienna, and Munich. The painter has signed the lower left of the painting with only Cassin. Charles was born in Lisieux, France in 1829. In 1873, he received a medal, third class, and at the World Exposition in 1889, he received 2 bronze medals. In 1857, he devoted his work to painting scenes of everyday life. This oil painting was restored in 1997. The dimensions are 23.5 inches wide by 26.5 inches tall. The materials are oil on canvas and it's under glass. The gold frame on the back states, M. de Forge Carpenters, Fin Etoile, and then it gives the address that I won't try to butcher. The provenance is that the painting was donated to the Molly Brown House Museum by Cornelia Kaiser Metz, July 12, 1971, which is incidentally the same year that the museum opened. Cornelia Kaiser Metz is the daughter of Henry Kaiser. We did research and they're not related to the Kaiser Permanente family. They're separate family. Kaiser Metz donations once furnished the house at 1340 Pennsylvania and once belonged to the Browns. So now we can get to our first presenter. Our first presenter is Becky Black. Becky is an art history educator who holds a PhD in art history and education from the University of Arizona. She is a journalist whose art historical research focuses on issues of power and identity in British commissioned depictions of World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust. Her research in art education also focuses on issues of power and identity and pedagogical practice and student engagement in undergraduate art history courses. Her work has been published in art education and interdisciplinary journals, and she has presented her research with CAA, NAEA, and internationally at the Center for the Study of Two World Wars at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Quebec City, Quebec. Becky has taught art history, art education, and art appreciation courses since 2013 and has extensive museum experience working with the Menil Collection, Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and the Jewish History Museum and Holocaust History Center in Tucson, Arizona. She's also a wonderful volunteer with Historic Denver's Molly Brown House Museum. Becky has served on the editorial board for the International Journal of Lifelong Learning in Art Education since 2017. And she currently serves on the editorial board of Art Education, the official journal of the National Art Education Association. Please help me in welcoming Becky to hear about her art history research.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. First things first, I get really excited talking about art history. I love it. I eat it. I breathe it. So if you need to calm me down a little bit, Amy, please do. So as we are looking at this painting, I want to turn it to the audience real quick. So looking at this work that's been on the screen for a while, what are some things we see here in this image that can tell us perhaps something about the artist or maybe something about the painting's meaning or the artist's intent here? What are just point out some things we see that might lead us somewhere? And you can type this in the chat or you can just speak freely. Casual and intimate scene. Yeah, we feel like we're sort of looking into something maybe is very personal. Oh, it is interesting that it's in a bedroom, and that dress too. That's got some stuff we're going to be talking about. So yeah, the setting of the composition, the clothing, and the parrot. That's absolutely right, Dana. We're going to be talking about birds tonight, and the bird is very important in this painting, no doubt. Thank you all for pointing all those great things out, and there's so much more that we could point out to lead us in research directions about this painting or the artist, but Andrea, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide. The back of the painting can also tell us just as much, and in some cases, if not more, about the artist, their particular cultural moment, their artistic practice. And so we're actually going to spend this first few minutes here talking about this particular stamp on the back of the painting. So let's dive in. On the back of this painting is a hallmark ink stamp, and these were common in the 19th century, of the Deforge and Carpentier Company. Now, where are we going? Whoa, there we go. Thank you, Andrea. Deforge Bertrand, he was a really well-known supplier to French artists particularly of the Barbizon school in 19th century France. And so he is someone we art historians know a lot about. And he wasn't really an artist, he was a supplier. So we know so much that we know this work by Coassin could not have been painted before 1858, because that's when Deforge partnered with Monsieur Carpentier, and the stamp on this painting indicates that partnership already existed. So we're starting around 1858 here, but wait, there's more that this stamp could tell us. This stamp also narrows down the date further, the date of production further rather, because of the address that Amy mentioned. And this address is really important. So between 1871 and 1879, Deforge and Carpentier operated their shop from this address we see on the back. Now, Mr. Deforge had already left the company and Carpentier had taken it over only for about 8 years. So 1871 to 1879 is a really important date for this painting in the museum's collection. So Coassin and so many other 19th century artists of Paris really relied on people like Deforge and Carpentier as what we call colormen. And these colormen like Deforge would often build stretchers or frames. They might mix the colors for the artist. And in many cases, the artist may sell their work to the colormen like Deforge as payment for supplies. And if you've ever heard of Jean-Francois Millet, the very famous French realist painter, he relied on Deforge specifically for this very sort of arrangement. And in the case of Millet, he paid off his paints by selling his works in Deforge's shop. So even though the hallmark indicates all of this interesting possibility about Coassin and his relationship with Deforge, it could just be that Coassin bought the materials during this 1871 to 1879 period and had no further relationship with Deforge. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, Coassin knew how to market himself, and so very likely relied on this relationship with Deforge and Carpentier to build a following, have his works in their shop window. Now, if we could show an image of the painting, I think if we go back one, I'm sorry, Andrea, I should have added another image of the painting. Thank you. Although Coassin was an academy-trained artist, right? He went to the best school in Paris. He even studied with people. One of his teachers was also the teacher of Edouard Manet. His other teacher studied with Jacques-Louis David, very famous neoclassical artist. And even though Coassin studied with those individuals and even showed at the salon shows for a number of years, unfortunately, he is not an artist that is well remembered in art history, and that is not uncommon. In Paris at this time, you had hundreds and hundreds of really talented artists like Coassin, working with people like Deforge and doing all the right things, yet art history has sort of forgotten them in many ways. In all likelihood, my opinion as an art historian is that Margaret may have seen this in a shop window in the 1890s when her and JJ were in Paris and purchased it, probably not knowing who Coassin was or what his background was or how talented he really was. She may have just bought it for the visual purposes or the visual pleasure of this particular painting because this frame is gorgeous, the painting is gorgeous. And as we'll talk about with iconography coming up, she probably recognized the iconography as well. And so before I move into what we actually see on the front of the painting, the things you pointed out, the dress, the bird, the room, etc. What is iconography? I'm using this word, but what does it really mean? And what does iconography in this painting tell us? So we pointed out the bird, for example. What is that? Iconography. We can think of iconography as symbols or conventions or compositional arrangements, the way in which the artist has put particular symbols or conventions. In this case, a young woman with a bird. That's very important iconography in the 19th century. So especially a young, beautiful woman in a very familiar, as someone said earlier, a very comfortable looking space. with an exotic bird, in this case, a parrot. This was not uncommon in the 19th century to see in paintings, and it held Christian meaning to its viewers because it's quite an old historical precedent coming to us from mid to later Christian visual culture in Europe. But really it's referencing the contrasting figures of the Virgin Mary with Mary Magdalene. So we have the fallen woman and the innocent woman, we have the saint and the temptress, right? All in one. If we look at our Khoisan painting, she's young, she looks rather innocent, she's wearing white, which we know in Western visual culture is a symbol of sort of innocence, purity. But then we've got this exotic bird that seems to be mid-flapping, so very energetic, very dynamic. And we have this dichotomy of the calm, the not calm, the good, perhaps not so good, sexual, innocence, all of this. And an infamous, very infamous, you've probably heard of him, contemporary of Khoisan was Gustave Courbet. And Andrea, if we could forward to the Courbet painting of a woman with a parrot. Yes. So Courbet and Gustave Courbet, he knew how to get his painting and his work out there. He had a big ego. He knew he had a big ego. He loved it. But this painting, painted in 1866, was well known in Paris when Khoisan was purchasing his supplies in the 1870s, or when he was painting this in the 1880s or 1890s. He would have been very familiar with this work because critics hated it. They absolutely hated Courbet's representation of this disheveled young nude woman. They hated the way that he arranged the composition. And so while the Academy and the establishment hated this work, other artists, including Paul Cézanne, absolutely loved this work. And in fact, it is rumored that Paul Cézanne had an image of this Courbet woman with a parrot painting for his own personal enjoyment. And so Khoisan would have known this, being a figure well known in the art circles, working with Deforge, Academy trained, working with those instructors. He would have known this painting, and he would have known that controversy sells. Can we say for sure he painted his work based on this one? No, but he would have known that historical precedent of the woman and the bird. Now, Courbet and Khoisan would have known the historical precedent of even older works and what sells, but especially at the particular moment both of those men were working, in particular Khoisan, because in the late 19th century, as we know, we have our second wave of feminism in Europe. And so industrialization was taking away job prospects for men, and urbanization was growing, and diseases were growing. And a lot of those diseases were sexually transmitted, which were often blamed on women. And so, Andrea, if you wouldn't mind forwarding to our next slide. You have other artists in Europe at this very time, like Félicien Ropes, depicting women as the sort of source of evil. Look, this woman here, this skeletal figure, just spreading babies everywhere, right, all over Europe. And the next one by Edvard Munch, again, addressing this dichotomy. This is titled Madonna, but it's also this Eve figure in many of Munch's replicas of this work. He did this composition several times. So this is Eve, but it's also Madonna, the fallen, the innocent, all together during the late 19th century as a sort of response to the idea of the dangerous woman, the temptress. And so do we know if Khoisan felt this way about women? If we progress to the next slide, please, we'll take a look at this handsome young gentleman. There he is, there's our artist. We don't know how Khoisan felt about feminism, about the femme fatale. We just don't know. We don't have enough research yet. We do know he had a long marriage and had a daughter who also later married well. We do know that Khoisan, based on the front of the painting, but also the back, he knew several important things. Number one, he knew how to paint. Obviously being academy trained by big name teachers, and he was aware of other works that were popular during the period and works that sold. He also knew the political and religious turmoil of France during that period, and some of his other works do address that. He also knew how to market himself by exhibiting in the Salon show for several years and by getting his work out into the public, perhaps in the shop window of Deforge and Carpentier. But most importantly, in my view, as an art historian, he knew his art history and used that knowledge to his advantage through this very common iconography of a woman and an exotic bird. But regardless if his depiction is about current or political social moments against feminism, He knew what would sell. Again, and this work here in America right now at Molly Brown House is evidence that he knew how to sell his works. He knew how to market his name and his work. And so one final note, knowing Margaret's reputation for bucking the system as a woman, I do find, personally, I find her choice to purchase this painting pleasantly subversive in a way. Perhaps Margaret, in all her worldly art knowledge, was also aware of the duality of the iconography of the exotic parrot, and perhaps she saw a bit of herself in this dichotomy of what a woman should or should not be in her particular cultural moment. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Again, lots more research to be done on Khoisan, but an interesting painting and an interesting artist nonetheless. Thank you.
We had a couple questions, Andrea.
Yes, we did. We had a couple questions in the chat. Becky, what do you think are there connections, iconography that makes it similar to something like the Leda and the Swan?
Yeah, absolutely. Those in what we find in early Christian visual culture, when Christianity was just developing, is that there was what we call syncretism, and this combination of older elements of visual culture and older bits of iconography. Say the image of the Virgin and Child is very much pulled from the Egyptian references of Isis and Child to create this Madonna and Child iconography. So in Greek mythology as well, we pull from images of Apollo, etc. So with Leda and the Swan in particular, absolutely, this sort of virginal, innocent woman with this dichotomy of, you know, Jupiter transforming into a swan, which Jupiter transformed into this beautiful golden eagle for Ganymede as well. So this idea of the bird and sexual innocence or evil innocence is very much possible.
And then Dana had a question. Could you explain more? What do you mean when you say academy trained?
Absolutely. So across Europe for several centuries, key sites like Paris and London had, for instance, in London, the Royal Academy, in Paris, the Paris Academy, also a Royal Academy, and these were the art schools. This is where you went if you wanted to be an artist and you wanted to have the best teachers and you wanted to exhibit in the Paris Salon, which was the biggest art show of its era, and it lasted for decades upon decades. That's how you made your name, was going to that particular art school, the academy, either in London or in Paris, or there are other academies across Europe as well, depending on the particular nation. But academy trained, that is certainly an exclamation point on any artist resume during this period. That's a good question.
Any other questions, Andrea?
That's it for now.
Okay. Well, Becky, I could listen to you all night. I love this stuff, and you're so knowledgeable, obviously. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. In keeping with the theme of birds, this series is focused on a piece of art in the house, but we're bringing in experts from different areas to talk around it and sort of put it in the context of the time and the trends, and of course, connecting it to Margaret Brown and her involvement in the suffrage movement and women's rights. So our next speaker is going to be Brian Myres. And I just want to tell you just a little bit of backstory. By the late 19th century, he's going to be talking about bird watching and women in that field. By the late 19th century, bird watching and botanizing had become acceptable, even genteel, recreational pursuits for middle and upper class women, writes Kathy S. Mason. And she wrote a 2002 article for The Historian. Unlike male ornithologists, however, who generally conducted detailed studies of their feathered subjects after trapping or shooting them, women usually spent many hours patiently watching nesting birds and recording their activities. We have Brian Myres here tonight to explore birding in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and birds as pets. Brian Myres taught biology at Cypress College in California for 32 years, including several seminars on ornithology. Brian has a life list of just over 3,000 birds observed on every continent except Antarctica. You got work to do, Brian. His main interests include evolution, ecology, and reptiles, including the feathered ones. So now go ahead, Brian, you can start with your set question about women.
Well, I want to talk first about a couple of people who are pre-Victorian era, because I think they're interesting. The first one is Princess Zenade Julie Bonaparte. And yes, from that family. She's the daughter of Napoleon's older brother. She married her cousin, who was, his name is Charles Laurent Bonaparte, and he is the son of Lucien, Bonaparte's younger brother. So she married her cousin. They came to America after Waterloo for some reason. Economics, maybe. The guillotine, maybe. No one knows, but certainly their family was having economic problems after Waterloo. Charles linked her to the symbol of conjugal bliss, the dove, the lovebird, as it was called at the time, because they often occur in mated pairs. And today we have Zenata doves. It's a Caribbean species, doesn't occur in the United States, maybe Southern Florida or someplace like that. But the genus of our doves, the mourning dove, a very common dove in America, and the white-winged dove, our desert dove, the genus, a scientific name, today is Zenata, after her. The picture you see here is Lucy Bakewell Audubon, Audubon's wife, and a tremendous amount of his support, especially for the family, since he was off chasing birds and drawing them. She was an educator and the family breadwinner. She ran a school and used that money to raise her family. He described 34 birds in the 4th American Ornithological Union checklist. 23 were named for people, all men. He described 21 birds in the 5th edition, 14 of them named for people, all men. He never named a bird for Lucy. But today we have Lucy's warbler, a little southwestern warbler, a very nice little bird. But it was named for Spencer Baird's daughter, apparently. Now, Spencer Baird was an ornithologist, and Baird's Sandpiper was named after Baird by Audubon himself. William Cooper of Cooper hawk fame, one of our more common hawks, was apparently so embarrassed about all this by Audubon that he named the warbler after both, some people say. His daughter was named Lucy, and Audubon's wife was named Lucy. But he died and never told anybody, so nobody's quite sure who's named for what. But Audubon never did name a bird for any woman, let alone his wife. We have to mention a young lady who unfortunately died at the age of 32 of typhoid fever. Her name, the next slide shows her. Her name was Genevieve Steele Jones. She's an artist from Ohio. She was called the other Audubon. She was so good at her artwork, and she worked mostly and drew mostly birds' eggs and nests. And she only did a couple of illustrations for her book that she planned on before she died of typhoid fever. Her family finished her book. Her mother did some of the artwork. It's not as good, but it had to suffice. She certainly would have been involved in Victorian times. As far as Victorian the age goes, bird art and art featuring birds, as our piece of art that we're working with here shows, was extremely popular beginning in the 1870s, right after the Civil War. But there were no professional women. They were discouraged from ornithological studies by the men in the field, many of whom made disparaging remarks about women who wanted to do field work. The women were called observers and kept out of scientific organizations, unfortunately. Many kept birds in extremely large and highly decorated cages, as you can see in the next slide. This is not one of the larger ones. This is probably one of the smaller ones. Very elaborate. Some of them were 10 feet high and housed large birds. This one is one of the smaller ones. You see how elaborate that they were. But the women in those times, slowly but surely, and remember, this is a time when women were beginning to ask for the vote and were rebelling about that. They slowly began to see themselves as caged birds in their great big Victorian elaborate homes, which they called cages, taking care of the children and without any kind of professional opportunities. The 1880s, as they came along, turned out to be very devastating for many birds. They were basically loved to death, like our national park today. The next slide shows one of the hats that was devised by the millinery people at the time. This one has a white dove on it, and almost all the birds, almost all the hats at the time had birds. Now, some of them were tremendously ornate. The next slide shows one that took quite a few feathers to make, from probably egret feathers or some bird like that. Those were very much in style at the time. The next slide shows a whole bird. You can see the bird's head right there on top. One whole bird made up the top of the hat. I'm not sure what kind of bird that is. It's a multicolored bird, but it's hard to tell like it is, but it is the whole bird. And then there were some hats, the next slide, as you can see, were made up of quite a few birds, and they stuffed a number of birds and put them on the hat. That feather hat craze caused whole populations of birds to be hunted out. If you want to see some more of these, you can go to Victorian bird hats on the internet, and you'll see a whole bunch of them. Some of them pretty ridiculous, but the whole idea was ridiculous and very harmful to bird populations. Frank Chapman, who worked at the Natural History Museum in New York City, counted 700 hats on the streets of New York City. 75% of them, 525 hats, were topped by feathers or whole birds of 40 different types. A single order in London showed 6,000 bird of paradise feathers from New Guinea, 40,000 hummingbirds from North and South America, 360,000 East Indian feathers of one kind or another. A 1902 auction in London showed 1,608 30-ounce packages of heron plumes. Each used 120 herons. So it took 193,000 herons killed. And that at the time when their feathers are most resplendent, the breeding season. So not only did the adults die, but the young in their nest died horrible deaths because they starved to death or were exposed to the elements. Hunters at the time got $32 an ounce for these feathers, 2 times the price of gold at the time, or about $1,000 per ounce in today's money. So you can see this is a money-making proposition, and people were more than willing to go out and destroy the birds and their habitats for it. The millinery industry at the time employed 83,000 people in 1900, and many countries were involved. I didn't realize how widespread it was myself. Australian lyrebirds, for instance, which are not a heavily populated bird, Australian lyrebirds were taken to the brink of extinction. When the Royal Society targeted women for blame and called them bird enemies, the author Virginia Woolf angrily pointed out that men did most of the dirty work and profited the most. Slowly but surely, people began to see pictures of this and what was happening to the birds and their nesting areas. And slowly but surely, a movement arose that countered this. And it was led by quite a few women at the time, not the professional ornithologists. They were killing birds for their own collections and didn't seem to be too concerned about this. But the fledgling Massachusetts Audubon Society boycotted the trade. They were called extremists and sentimentalists by the industry. Politicians worried about job loss and that their investments were being endangered. If that sounds familiar, same thing goes on quite a bit today. So the opposition over the slaughter of those birds came not from the professionals, but more from women's organizations and social organizations in Europe and Europe. One woman in America was Florence Marion Bailey. You see her picture next. She was instrumental in many of the moves to help protect the birds. I'll mention her later. Margaret Smith in the UK, Emily Williamson in the UK started the Society for the Protection of Birds. Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall, who were cousins and were in the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and their boycott of the trade. The opposition led to the Lacey Act of 1900, the first federal protection for birds only after two wardens were shot and killed in reserves as people were trying to collect the birds. The wardens were actually killed trying to protect them. There's also a fairly humorous thing that occurred that actually helped this effort, and that's the auto industry. And what could the auto industry have to do with this? Well, if you remember, the cars pre-1900 and shortly thereafter were all open cars. They didn't have any roof. And so when they started to enclose cars, a lot of these hats wouldn't fit in the car, and it would knock the hat off their head or knock the feathers off the hat. And women just got tired of it. And so at least the hats got a lot smaller than they had been before, and not so elaborate, required a lot fewer feathers. I don't know how much of an effect that had, but I thought it was kind of comical. My favorite woman in the movement was Rosalie Edge, whose picture you see her here. At the 25th meeting of the National Association of Audubon Societies, which is the precursor to the Audubon Society today, was dominated by professional men. Well, she stood up and challenged the board's behavior with its links to firearms companies, sports shooting organizations, dodgy financial handlings. The men refused to recognize her at the meeting, and the meeting ended before she could say too much. But she really started a revolution that would change conservation and ornithology for the better. She was also active in the women's suffrage movement and played an instrumental role in passing the 19th Amendment, which is not unusual for this group of women. They were not only against the bird plume trade, but interested in women getting the vote. She founded the Emergency Conservation Committee, and she sued Audubon societies. She sent out a pamphlet that was ghostwritten with a man's signature on it so that people would read it, which exposed the corruption within the conservation organizations. She also created the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. Hawk Mountain today is a sanctuary, it still is, but it was used by people who just like to shoot hawks. And people would line up to shoot the hawks that were flying south for the winter over that sanctuary. She also pushed for the formation of Olympic National Park and Kings Canyon National Park. And more importantly, even, I think, she provided Rachel Carson with evidence for linking DDT to raptor declines later in her life. She lived to see many of the changes she fought for, and she died in 1962. Post-Victorian, of course, Rosalie Edge, who was instrumental until her death in 1962, long after Victorian times. Florence Marion Bailey, who we mentioned before, the first woman fellow of the American Ornithological Union, and author of the first field guide. That's pretty much unknown because when you say field guide, everyone thinks of Roger Torrey Peterson, who wrote his famous field guides in the 1930s and on through until his death quite a few years later. She wrote the Handbook of Birds of the Western United States, and a rather novel thing she promoted through her activities and through one of her publications called Birds Through an Opera Glass. She promoted the watching of birds through binoculars rather than the way they used to identify them, shoot them and pick them up and take a close look at them. So that had a regular positive effect on bird populations, and more people picked that up. Of course, today nobody is shooting birds to identify them. I don't think, at least I hope not. Margaret Nice was another person who was instrumental. I think we have her picture on the next slide. Maybe not, maybe I don't have Margaret Nice. She wrote in 1924, The Birds of Oklahoma, and her studies of song sparrows in her backyard in Columbus, Ohio, while raising 5 daughters, are recognized as some of the best behavioral studies ever done on birds. She just sat and watched her birds all the time and watched their behavior, their nesting, she quoted on their anatomy, all kinds of things, and published enormous numbers of papers dealing with song sparrows. She and Bailey, Marion Bailey, were the first women to receive the AOU's Brewster Award. Brewster was one of the founders of the American Ornithological Union. And the award is a very prestigious award of the AOU, is given for authors' contributions to the study of birds in North America. The times are changing. Today, there are many women professional ornithologists, maybe more than men, as a matter of fact, studying birds all over the world. I may mention one here, a woman by the name of Rosemary Grant, who with her husband Peter studied Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, and showed, they were evolutionary studies, and showed that natural selection could act on both the anatomy and the behavior of birds in those populations over fairly short periods of time. Very instrumental study in ornithology and in evolution. So more people today studying birds who are women, even though they were kind of kept out of the field early on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. So informative and interesting, and to put women in that context really changes the narrative from what we've heard mostly, from other sources. So thank you. Andrea, were there any questions for Brian in the chat?
We did have a couple questions, and I can go back to the slide. Can you remind us, Brian, what this young lady's name was?
Let's see, I have to get her first name. Her last name is Jones. Let's set my papers aside. Genevieve Estelle Jones, who grew up in Ohio. She may have some Jamaican ancestry. She wasn't originally from Ohio, so she may have been the first minority woman ornithologist, or at least artist of ornithology. So it's not quite clear, though. I don't know if they know that much about her background, but it seemed to me like she may have had some Caribbean ancestry of some kind.
And then do they know if she was able to discover any new birds?
Well, she only lived to 32, and I think all that she did was go out and find birds' nests with eggs in them and the birds that were nesting on it, and do drawings from that. I think she was more of an artist and was interested in the art of birds' nests and birds' eggs than she was an ornithologist. She really didn't have the educational background and didn't live long enough really to study very much about ornithology.
Can her work be found online?
Yeah, I should have grabbed one of the pictures that was shown. There is some information about her online, but not very much.
Fabulous. Oh, it looks Becky put a link up. Is that to some of her work, Becky?
Yeah, it's the Smithsonian's page about her. Brian, you've got me on a research tangent. I love it.
Nice.
I love it. So if everyone wants to save or click on that link, that will take you to some of Ms. Jones's work. And those were our questions for now, Amy.
Oh, awesome. We did have one quick true or false for Brian's presentation, interactive, before we move on to our last presenter. Were you able to find that one, Andrea?
Yes, can everyone see the poll?
The Lacey Act or the Migratory Bird Act of 1918 halted all bird feather sales in the US.
Is that true or false?
Right now we were in a dead heat and now we're at 67% are voting for false, 33% are about, we're back to half and half. We're a very tied bunch on the subject.
Tell us the answer, Brian.
Well, that's false. As a matter of fact, you can go in today into hobby stores and buy some feathers. The good thing is that all this hunting has stopped, and the feathers that are collected from birds that have dropped their feathers, things like that, not from killing birds. But you can still buy some bird feathers legally. Peacock feathers are sent from India, I believe. And the word is that those peacock feathers just come from fallen feathers. At least we would hope so. It's probably the least controlled one, but you can buy feathers from some birds that are collected. You just can't kill birds to get their feathers anymore. So it is legal to sell some, but not from endangered species or species that are on critical lists of one kind or another.
Well, that's good news. We've made quite a bit of progress there. That's for sure. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your knowledge and all those photographs. That was really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So our last presenter, all this talk about art inspires me to do some art and the birds. And we have Annie Willson here with us to demonstrate her clayboard techniques with us and talk about her inspiration and instruct us to create a work of art of our own. And if you don't have the supplies, it's still awesome to watch. I love watching people create art. Annie Willson is a Longmont, Colorado-based artist who gets her inspiration from nature and interconnected mystery of it all. As an elementary art teacher and a mother to a 5-year-old, Juniper, there's usually a lot of movement within her work. As an artist, a mom and a teacher, Annie hopes to inspire others to use the power of creativity for good. Here's Annie Willson. Go ahead, Annie.
Great. Can you see me? Nope. Wonderful. I have always been inspired. One second here. My notes just anyway, here we go. I've always loved birds. Even as a child, I remember looking up into the sky and watching birds of all shapes and sizes soar overhead and wishing that I could fly. On those magical days when I was able to find a feather of my own on the ground, I felt a connection to the winged wonders above me. I wanted to fly with them, and I still do. As an artist, the way that I fly is through the art that I make. Next picture, please. Thank you. One way that I get inspiration, not only from the feathers that I find or see, or the birds that fly above me, I'll go to the library. I love the library. It's such a wonderful, fantastic resource. I'll search through the pages and I'll find birds or images that I like. And now I'm even more inspired with this Genevieve Steele Jones woman. I want to go look her up and see what she can teach me. Next image, please. This is an example of a feather that I've created. It isn't necessarily a specific feather but maybe a combination of lots of different feathers that I've created. Oftentimes when I create with clayboard, scratchboard, this is the image that came from that. It's from my imagination as well. So I'll take something and then I'll make it my own. Next image, please. I've always loved birds. They're just so powerful and amazing. And I've always wished that I could fly. And there's something magical to me about this process of scratchboard and clayboard. Sometimes I lose myself in the work that I create. I let go. It's like my moving meditation. I have a hard time sitting still. So when I create, that's how I let my imagination work. I love lines. I love the way that they flow. I love the way that they speak through me. Just moving my notes down here for 1 second. All right, next image, please. As a mom, that's of a very active 5-year-old, that's a big part of who I am and what I create. So oftentimes the art that I make with birds in particular will have 2 images. One maybe representing a parent, and one maybe representing a smaller being being cared for. Next image, please. This, I actually made this when I was pregnant with my daughter. And this is representative of me and my daughter, Juniper. Next image, please. This is a feather that I created. I don't know exactly what kind of feather, but it's all feathers. Yeah. Next image, please. Thank you. So this is one of the ways that I create with clayboard. Clayboard, you can get it pre-inked black, or you can get it white, and you can add the ink yourself. The purple image is an example of a type of ink that that I put on, and then underneath it is a scratch tool that I used. And then next, oh, and here's my daughter right here. We were just talking about you. Sweet dreams. So that's a different example of different ways that my imagination can be transformed into different examples. Let me scroll down here for my notes a little bit more. Okay. So what inspires you to create? That's a question I'm going to put out for people there. Ooh, okay. Color, nice. Color is good. So when I can't get an idea out of my head, nice. So here's an example of one of the clay boards. Ooh, seeing through others' creations, nice. I like it. Here's an example of a clay board that I inked. Okay, here's a white one, and then here's some ink that I put on. Some of the scratchboard ink, I'll put it on a couple drops. A little bit goes a long way. Put some ink on. And then with my little handy dandy scrapey tools, sometimes I will look at an actual feather, right? Can everybody see okay? Yeah, okay. Sometimes I'll look at the books again for an image, for an idea. This one in particular I liked. Then I'll start scraping away. With this particular tool, the closer I hold it to the end, the easier it is for me to work with. If I hold it all the way back, I don't get as much power or strength. So I'll hold it on the edge, right? And I'll start creating. Oh, okay. All right, let me fix that. Thank you for letting me know that about the blur. Is that better? Better? Awesome. So this one was a little purple, the ink. I'll scrape away. Okay. I'll hold it on the edge. What am I feeling right now? I'm feeling inspired is what I'm feeling right now, especially learning about Genevieve Steele Jones, and also learning about the women and a long time ago and how they still went out and looked at birds and feathers. So I'm gonna start seeing what happens. So I'm gonna hold this and I'm gonna start scraping away. It might get a little messy, but it's still fun. So there's one line that I made. It's quick. I'm gonna make another little line here. I'm gonna make a line right down the middle. I'm gonna make some lines this way. This feather is kind of looking more like a leaf, but that's okay. One nice thing about when I create is that it may not always be what I want it to be, but that's okay. I'm not afraid to go where my imagination takes me. So there's some more lines. You can get really big clayboards. You can get them like 3 feet by 3 feet. You can also get them like this size, 5 by 5, 6 by 6. Some people prefer the pre-inked black. Some people like adding the color themselves. Add a couple more lines. It's satisfying. It's very meditative and soothing to me. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to add some other on the other side. This wing is kind of looking more like a feather, but you know what? It's okay. I'm kind of feeling right now that I want to fly myself to the internet and look up this Genevieve Steele Jones lady. So that's kind of where I'm feeling right now. Oh, thank you, Andrea. It is very calming and soothing to me to be able to create. Yeah. So sometimes I think a mistake might not actually be a mistake, but an opportunity. So to take me to a brand new place, to open up my creative wings and soar. Yeah. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or thoughts?
Should they be following along with you at this point because they have?
Oh, sorry. You can if you want to, or just kind of take it in your own way. Do what you're feeling. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Are we doing okay for time?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
They got in their kit a series of different tools.
Oh, great.
So would you like to tell them how they could get wider lines or thinner lines?
Yeah. So which tools did you get in your kit?
Dana, can you hold up the tools that you have and show us?
Yeah. Oh, nice. Okay, great. So with the scrapey tools, oftentimes you can, depending on how you hold them, or depending on like, you can hold them on the edge, and if you use them on the edge and curve, yeah, that's a really good one. The one, yeah, that one. You can get finer lines or longer lines, depending on if you hold it on the edge or if you take it on the tip. So like for this one, if you like, you can hold it like right on the edge and it'll make a fine little line. Whereas if you take the curvy one and you hold it on the edge, you can make a don't do that. You can make a wider line, right? Like that. Let me get another one there. That happens sometimes. So you can kind of curve it like that so that the line is wider. Cool.
So what I'm hearing you say is play with
Yeah, play.
it.
Play with it. Just don't be afraid to let your imagination loose.
Yeah.
Set your creative feathers aflight, so to speak. Yeah. Just kind of take it and play. See where it takes you. Now this one, so I broke one of my nibs, but oh well. This is kind of turning into something else here. This is kind of turning into like a different kind of a feather. Kind of like a butterfly feather, I think. I don't know, I'm just kind of going with it.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Right.
Yeah. Just play. Just play with it. Enjoy.
Do you
Enjoy
ever
yourself.
draw on top of the ink before you start scraping?
You know what? That's a good question. I haven't, not yet, but it's a new day. Maybe I could try that. I'm not opposed to trying that idea. Yeah. Oh,
Oh, we just got another person
Okay.
coming in.
okay. Yeah, the key is the closer you hold it to the ends, the easier it is to work with. If you hold it all the way down here, you don't get as much fine line or fine detail. No. Mhm.
Does anybody have questions about Annie's inspiration or her techniques?
There's nothing in the chat right now, but I always encourage everyone, they're welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions, or yes, pop it in the chat for us.
Yeah, I imagine you could do a transfer, like print something out and color on the back with chalk or something. And then
Yeah, you
print
could.
it.
I never have, but I have heard that you can do that. Good question. Both. Yeah, I've done a little of this and a little of that, and actually, I actually made this also. It's my shirt with the Solar Fast, which is another kind of art form that I like to create. It's like printing different images. So I kind of like line. It's kind of where it's at for me. So birds have always been part of me, and I also like to take the lines that I make and kind of recreate the images on clayboard and scratchboard, sometimes onto the clothes that I wear. So yeah.
Very nice.
Yes.
It's certainly is a good inspiration. I paint birds a lot. They're so colorful, and the patterns and colors. Well, if we don't have any questions for Annie, I just want to say thank you, Annie, for letting us into your artistic world and showing us a new technique that we might use. And Annie wanted to ask a question. She wanted to ask us, where will our wings take us?
Yeah.
And I think that's lovely to leave us with. So much fun. So we hope that everyone has enjoyed tonight's evening. Thank you again for coming. We've included some relevant links in the chat here if you would like to extend your learning or look at more of Annie's artwork. She's got quite a bit of it up on Fine Art America. The first one is a good article about Victorian women in birding. The second one is a great digital resource for discovering or learning more about 19th century artists that Becky has helped us with. And then there's a book link about 19th century painting. And then the two links below are where you can go and see some more of Annie's artwork. You may also be interested in an upcoming virtual 1340 pin that we have. It's called Is Mrs. Brown Still Here? And it's taking place next Thursday. We have actors that act out different aspects of Molly Brown. Margaret Brown. You can check us out at mollybrown.org for more details. And we'd also love your feedback about tonight's event because we're wanting to do more of these and we want to do a good job and engage our audience. So if you can take a moment to see, do we have the survey, Andrea, to drop in the chat?
We will be sending that out in the email follow-up along with these
cool.
links and a link to this recording tonight. So if you want to go back and see any of the images or things like that, we'll have it all in the recording.
And if you complete the survey, you can be entered into the chance to win a free ticket for a future Art with Amy event. Yeah. So have a great night. Thank you all for attending. Goodbye.